Hey, ghoul friend. It's me, Adrian, or Ayden. Either way, I am still your host, and you are still listening to Susto, the podcast of paranormal folklore from Latin American cultures. Welcome back, and thank you for being here. And if this is your first time, thank you so much for joining us. Listen, I'm just going to start this off with being very vulnerable as a creator. There's a lot of noise happening right now. It is the middle of the day as I'm recording this, so there is a bird right outside the office that is just going off for whatever reason. I just heard Margaret meow a minute ago, so nobody's cooperating. And this is why, again, I'm very excited to get into a studio space that is way more sound controlled than our office slash guest room slash studio. That being said, we'll see. Maybe none of those sounds will end up coming out in the final edit because I am such a professional, but we will see if I can live up to that standard. Either way, thanks so much for being here. Really quick, short updates. First off, the book club for May should have been announced by now, by the time you are listening to this. So this is why it's very important to follow along on every social media platform. That's at Susto Podcast on every platform. I post every and all updates about the show, about what we are doing on those pages. So just make sure that you follow those. Shortly after that, once we have the actual meeting itself, the discussion, which again is open to anybody. So if you read along this month, please feel free to join us. The meeting details again will be posted on social media, and then we will announce next month's read. As always, like I said, the book club itself is open to anybody. It's free to join. However, Patreon subscribers do get to vote on what we read. So if you're interested in that and other perks, you can visit sustoplus.com. Speaking of, if you're watching the video, look, we have a little guest right here. There she is. That's Margaret. Hopefully, now that she sees where the voice is coming from, she will chill out and just hang out in the background. Anyway, summer is here. I'm very excited. I spent a lot of time this Memorial Day weekend walking around on the trail, just soaking in on the nature. I'm trying really hard to romanticize summer this year. Usually I do not look forward to it at all because it is so hot, but I'm trying to just lean into it and just think about, okay, how can we, make this fun and not so miserable. Just trying to change my outlook on that. But I digress. Before we get into today's episode, as always, you can support Susto by engaging wherever you are listening, which means leaving positive ratings and reviews or comments. And you can also support Susto, as I've mentioned several times now, by visiting sustoplus.com and deciding if there's anything on there that tickles your fancy that you might be into. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into today's episode, which is all about the Mummies of Guanajuato. The first cholera waves rolled through Mexico in the 1830s like an invisible army. Entire streets emptied. Church bells rang so often for the dead that, in some towns, the sound became part of the weather. Cemeteries filled faster than gravediggers could work. Tombs were stacked close together. New burial grounds spread up hillsides and beyond city limits. In many places, families turned to above-ground crypts, sealing their dead inside stone chambers meant to preserve dignity while saving precious space. But death kept coming, and land kept running out. So graveyards across Mexico adopted a harsh solution. If families could not continue paying burial fees, the remains of their loved ones would be evicted from their final resting places. Bones would be taken from grave sites and transferred into ossuaries, communal depositories for skeletal remains, so the graves could be reused for the newly, more financially privileged dead. In the mountain city of Guanajuato, however, something stranger happened. Guanajuato is a city that seems carved directly into the earth. A narrow valley whose streets twist between brightly painted buildings that climb steep hillsides. The surrounding mountains are rich with minerals such as silver, iron, and sulfur buried deep beneath the rock. The air is dry enough that sweat disappears from your skin almost as soon as it forms. Under the afternoon sun, the hills grow ochre and gold. It is a stunning, winding valley that is as beautiful as it is unforgiving. In 1861, the cemetery known as Panteón Santa Paula introduced its burial tax. Families who could no longer afford the payments would eventually lose the right to keep relatives interred there, forfeiting a perpetual burial. For several years, little was done to enforce this tax. Then, in 1865, cemetery workers were finally ordered to begin exhuming bodies from unpaid crypts. One of the first belonged to a man named Dr. Remigio Leroy, remembered locally as the French doctor. Dr. Leroy died in 1860. As a foreigner, he had no large extended family in Guanajuato to continue paying the burial tax, nor would there be any relatives gathered outside the crypt to protest its opening. No priest standing nearby, praying forgiveness for the disrespect about to take place. Only laborers with iron tools descending into the cemetery corridors. When they opened the tomb, they expected decay. Instead, they found a man. The doctor's body had dried rather than decomposed. His skin still clung tightly to his face. His beard remained intact. His clothing had not rotted away. It was as if the dry mountain air and mineral-rich soil had slowly transformed him into leather and parchment instead of dust. The workers reportedly did not know what to do with him. Eventually, they carried the body beneath the cemetery and stood it upright against the wall of an underground ossuary. Finding one preserved corpse would have been unsettling enough. Then, they found another, and another. As more graves were opened for unpaid taxes, workers discovered that many of the dead had undergone the same transformation. The conditions inside the crypts of heat, dryness, mineral content, and limited moisture had naturally and unintentionally mummified the bodies. Some remained eerily recognizable. Others had deteriorated into skeletal forms wrapped in stretched skin. Many appeared frozen in expressions of agony, mouths hanging permanently open in what looked like silent screams. In reality, the expression was likely caused by muscles and ligaments relaxing after death, allowing the jaw to fall open in an eternal yawn. But to the people seeing them for the first time in torchlight beneath the cemetery, science offered little comfort. The deeper the workers went, the more disturbing the discoveries became. One mummy belonged to a woman who had been 4 months pregnant when she died. Her tiny fetus was later removed from her preserved body and displayed beside her, becoming one of the smallest mummies in the world. Another body became the source of one of Guanajuato's most haunting legends, a woman named Ignacia Aguilar. According to local accounts, Ignacia suffered from a condition that could slow her heart so much that it could mimic death. Her family, believing she had passed away, buried her quickly. When her body was eventually exhumed, grave workers claimed she had changed position inside the coffin. Injuries marked her forehead. She lay face down with her arms beneath her, as though she had awakened in darkness, struck the coffin lid trying to escape, and finally collapsed in exhausted resignation. Whether the story is true or embellished over time hardly matters now. In Guanajuato, the line between documented history and folklore has always been thin. News of the mummies spread quickly through the city. Soon, cemetery workers began charging curious visitors a few pesos to descend into the ossuary corridors and view the preserved dead. Tourists, travelers, and townspeople came to stare into the faces of people who had once walked the same streets above them. But over time, something else besides dignity disappeared. Names vanished. Tags identifying the dead went missing. Personal belongings disappeared. Records became incomplete. Many of the bodies belonged to poor families already erased from official memory by poverty and time. Without names attached to them, cemetery workers and guides began inventing identities and stories to entertain visitors. The unknown dead became caricatures. La Bruja, the witch. El Ahogado, the drowned man. Tales grew more elaborate with every retelling, each story helping draw larger crowds underground. The people too poor to remain buried with honor slowly lost even the memory of who they once were. The final body was exhumed in 1958. By then, 111 mummies had been removed from their graves and lined along the underground walls of the cemetery corridors. A decade later, in 1968, the city opened a formal museum around the collection. Today, 59 of the mummies remain on permanent display. Every year, hundreds of thousands of tourists visit Museo de Las Momias de Guanajuato. The museum generates millions of dollars for the city and has become one of Guanajuato's most recognizable attractions. For decades, many of the mummies were displayed standing upright, just as workers had originally leaned them against the walls after exhumation. Some even traveled internationally in exhibitions, including tours through museums in the United States in the late 2000s. But in recent years, the collection has become the center of an ethical debate. Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, known as INAH, has criticized the museum's preservation practices and treatment of the bodies. Officials argue that the mummies were not properly stored and were damaged through repeated handling and transport. Some examinations reportedly found evidence of fungal growth on several bodies, raising concerns that spores could spread to workers and visitors through poorly sealed display cases. INAH has also pushed for something more fundamental: restoring identities to the dead. Researchers argue that these were real people, laborers, mothers, children, immigrants whose bodies ended up on display largely because their families could not afford a burial tax. Descendants, they say, deserve to know what became of their ancestors. To leave the dead unnamed, posed for photographs, and marketed as entertainment risks turning poverty itself into spectacle. Yet many people in Guanajuato see the matter differently. For them, the mummies are not simply curiosities. They are part of a broader cultural relationship with death that exists throughout Mexico. Cemeteries are not always places of silence and distance. Families visit graves with food, candles, and music. During Day of the Dead, the boundary between the living and the dead is treated less like a wall and more like a doorway. To many locals, the mummies are not hidden away in shame. They are remembered, seen, acknowledged. And so the question remains unresolved beneath the hills of Guanajuato. At what point does remembrance become exploitation? When does preserving the dead become pageantry? And what do the mummies themselves represent? A scientific accident, a cultural tradition, or a warning about how easily poverty can follow a person even beyond the grave? Welcome back, Ghoul friends. Thank you so much for tuning into that story. So this is one that we've been wanting to cover for quite a while, but I've never felt an urgency to do so because I feel like there has been a lot of coverage on the Mummies of Guanajuato. But we figured, you know what? It's time. Let's go for it. So the first source that we have here is from nationalgeographic.com, and this is titled, "These Mexican Mummies Draw Crowds and Controversy." This is published in 2022 by Jennifer Barger. Thank you, Jennifer, for writing this. And obviously, you know, this is a real place. The Museum of Mummies is a real place in Mexico, in Guanajuato, Mexico. And this article starts off, "Guanajuato, Mexico has been on the UNESCO World Heritage List since 1988, thanks to its colonial Spanish architecture, silver mining history, and sites related to the Mexican Revolution." This goes on a bit more about Mexico. Then this says, "But the biggest tourist attraction in the central Mexican city is darker and more gruesome than all that. An underground museum of 100 mummies." This is published in 2022. I know that we said it says like recently there's maybe closer to 50 or 60 of them that are still on display. This is a no pun intended, a living exhibit, right? So I'm sure like, you know, things change, they swap bodies in and out, and they make decisions about how many they want to display at any given time, right? But this says, "The slack-jawed men, leathery-skinned infants, and other corpses have been luring curious travelers for more than a century. Visitors first paid a few pesos to visit the mummies in an underground crypt. Since 1969, they've been displayed under spooky spotlight at the Museo de Las Momias. These naturally preserved corpses," and in parentheses it says no bandages or embalming here, "from the 19th and 20th centuries are a revenue generator and a source of local pride for this city, about an hour's drive west of San Miguel de Allende. The Mummies of Guanajuato bring the biggest economic income to the municipality after property tax," says Mexican anthropologist Juan Manuel Argüelles San Millan. "Their importance is hard to overstate." And this is where that sort of debate starts, right? Is, you know, there's people that are from here, from this area, that are involved in community and anthropology. And, you know, there's, I think like on surface level, the debate is you do want to be wary about something like this, right? It's like, what is the line between exploitation, especially because these people, and by these people, I mean the mummies, the corpses on display, they never consented to any of this, right? It was never even an idea in their imaginations, I think, that the Museo de Las Momias would exist, that right? Like, how could you even think of something like that? So this was never even a concept in their mind. So obviously there is no like autonomy there. Like it just does not exist. And so it's like, is it ethical to put these bodies on display? But also some people would argue and say, well, what does it matter? Because they're dead. Like their bodies were not claimed. They were left. And people living today that benefit from this, from the community, say, you know, it's a point of pride and it is something that helps the community here. So like, why not let it exist? Why not use it to bring in, you know, revenue more than property taxes at this point in 2022, right? So there's many different ways to argue it. Me personally, I don't think I would get involved in that argument because I'm not from there. So I feel like I have no real say. If I had to give an opinion though, and I'm going to because, hello, I'm in front of a microphone. Why not, right? I would say that it depends on how the bodies are treated. Like, I've never been to this museum. I would like to go, right? But I would be very conscious about, okay, like, how are they being presented? Like, they're displayed behind these, like, glass cases. So it looks like it is done with respect. It would be a different story if there was like, you know, like flashing lights and signs and it's like, ooh, check out the spooky mummies right here. It doesn't seem like campy or like kitschy in that way. It seems like this is like a real display that is being put on with respect. It doesn't feel gimmicky, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I would be very conscious about that. As long as it doesn't feel that way, I think my opinion is like, okay, let it happen because the community benefits from it as a whole. But again, I am not from that community, so I cannot speak for them. This continues. Right here it says, the mummies are also controversial. Travelers from other cultures have a hard time grasping why one of Mexico's most beautiful cities displays macabre human remains. Some scholars think the bodies are badly stored and mislabeled. Earlier this year, plans for a glitzy new Momias museum were scrapped after scholars and UNESCO reps balked at its location atop a proposed downtown shopping mall. Okay, see, that I'm with them on that. I'm like, really, in a shopping center? Like, that feels, it should be like its own standalone thing. Maybe at a cemetery, right? Like the cemetery that they were found at, like put the museum there. But then also that could cause a disruption to the rest of the cemetery. It's tricky, and this is why I am not making those decisions. And the city of Guanajuato is not calling me. They're not rushing to get my opinion on this, right? Also, I don't want to assume what people know, but momias is the Spanish word for mummies. So if you hear me using the word momias, that's what that is. It's interchanged throughout these sources. This says, it's all brought renewed attention to these fragile remains. The National Institute of Anthropology and History just launched a study headed by San Millán to determine the identities of the mostly anonymous bodies. An exhibition of sensitively crafted photographs of the mummies by local artist Michael James Wright will headline at Guanajuato's esteemed annual Festival Internacional Cervantino, October 13th through 30th, and then go on tour in Mexico and abroad. These projects, this is a quote, these projects can dignify the dead and turn them into something educational instead of a sideshow, says Wright. Okay, that is exactly on line with what I was thinking, is make it educational, make it like a culture swap thing, not a sideshow. Also, this was published in 2022, so that's probably when that festival happened, but I'm like, where can I find these photos? I think those would be really cool to see. If I can find some of those photos, I will throw them up here on the video if you have access to that on Patreon, and use them for the social media post for this episode. This says here, haha, funny joke. Who wrote this again? Funny joke, Jennifer. Jennifer writes, here we unwrap how the mummies and their museum came to be and why it continues to draw crowds to Guanajuato. Hilarious. Jennifer writes, despite Guanajuato's spectacular historic city center, the Mummies Museum at the edge of town is often the first place tourists visit. I'm going to see the aunts, joke Mexicans heading to Guanajuato. People stand in line for hours to enter the museum, elbow to elbow with street vendors hawking charamusca, a local cinnamon sugar candy shaped like what else? Mummies. And then there's also a photo here from 1911 that shows the mummies in their original display space. And it's like a tunnel. It looks like it's underground. It's like an arched tunnel, arched at the top, like rocks and dirt on the side. And the bodies are just open air lined up on the side. It must have been so surreal to walk down this hallway and be face to face with these mummies, like not protected by anything. Again, just open air. Wow, that's wild. Again, and also that picture will be up in the video or on social media. This says Mexican tourists tend to accept corpses on display with a mix of interest and respect, but not revulsion. This is the birthplace of Dia de los Muertos after all. Quote, but for travelers from other parts of the world, I really have to put the museum in context, says Dante Rodriguez Zavala, a Guanajuato native and guide with Mexico Street Food Tours. Quote, for Mexicans, this isn't bizarre or weird. We have a comfort level with death. We take food to our dead loved ones on Day of the Dead and invite mariachis into the cemetery. That's very true. I feel like Mexicans, and that I can attest to when, I'm back home and we go to cemeteries to see loved ones, especially on like certain holidays, the cemeteries, it looks like there is a festival going on or something. It looks like a big party. There are people that set up, they bring like tents, like the vendor tents almost, like to block the sun out. They set up chairs, there's coolers, there's food, there's various groups of mariachis, there's people blasting music. It's really beautiful to see. It gives me chills every time I go and I see it. But yeah, like Mexican people do have a different relationship with death than many other cultures. And there are other cultures, there are tons of cultures that have very niche, unique relationships to death and how they transition people from, living to like putting them to rest. But this says, around Guanajuato, you'll hear ghostly whispers about the origin of the momias. Some were buried alive, others died in a cholera outbreak, all were preserved due to mineral-rich soil. Quote, plus, to make people interested in seeing the mummies, cemetery workers started telling stories about hangings, desperados, and witches, says Gerald Gonlogue, a diagnostic imaging professor emeritus with Guinea-Bach University who has extensively studied the mummies. Then this tells about how they were discovered. It says, opening the tombs, workers expected dusty bones. Instead, they found many bodies still remarkably intact with skin, hair, even tongues. That's wild. The warm, dry environment turned out to be ideal for preserving human remains. If the sun hits the niches all day, as is the case in the Santa Paula, it causes the bodies to quickly dehydrate, says Maria del Carmen Lerma Gomez, a forensic anthropologist working on the INAH study. Interesting. So it was just all the right things: right place, right time, right conditions, coincidence, like completely unintentional. And then this goes on to talk about how the cemetery workers started turning a profit on the bodies, and how they were charging a small fee to admit people into the quote chamber of horrors, which was a winding staircase that led to the crypt, where the bodies were again lined up on either side of this walkway, this hallway. And then this talks about, like we mentioned in the story, how this says, over the years, tourists swiped the mummies' name tags as souvenirs, robbing most bodies of their identities. Museum guides and locals filled in the gap with new monikers and magical narratives. A female body deformed by severe scoliosis called La Bruja, another corpse known as El Ahogado, or the drowned man, which I hate that this person that had severe scoliosis, they're like, oh, that's the witch, that's why she looks like that. That's terrible. You see, that's where it gets unethical, where I'm like, who knows, there may have been a real witch, amongst one of these bodies, but that just feels so shitty to do that to somebody. And again, I see it all the time. People are like, oh, who cares, they're dead, they don't know any different. But I'm like, there's just like, I don't know, there's a level of respect that I think people should have for the dead. And to me, it's just like, it feels icky, because I would hate for, like, if somebody discovered my body and for some reason they were like, ugh, he's ugly, he's the ugly man, and then that's my legacy, that's my story. But also I'm like, what would I know? I would be dead unless my spirit was lingering around my body. Like, why would I know? I don't know. It's just, I don't, it's icky to me. So this talks a bit more about that INAH study and how they want to improve how the bodies are showcased. This last quote here, I'll read it, says, "These are just regular people who are repositories of information about the period they lived in," says Gonlongwe. "They walked these streets. They went to the old market. They shouldn't be a freak show." I agree with that. I don't think that is a scalding hot take. I think there is a way to display, to talk about the history, to exhibit the corpses, because it's also a very just an interesting situation where, like, oh, this was completely unintentional. Look at what happened because of, again, these instances that happened to line up, and it was the perfect combination of things for these bodies to be preserved. Approach it that way, but not as a freak show. And it starts to enter that quote freak show side when we start making up stories about people because their bodies are not what we would expect a typical body to look like. You know what I mean? I don't know. It just, again, it's that ickiness. Okay. On that ickiness, we're going to go ahead and take a break. Welcome back, Will friends. Okay, jumping into the next source. This is from the littlehouseofhorrors.com, and this is the Guanajuato Mummies. That's what it is titled. I do not see a published date or an author on here, so sorry for that. But again, as always, you can find direct links to the sources in the Susto Google Docs on sustoplus.com. So this starts off by talking about how these bodies ended up here, what was the reason for them being exhumed and all that. And this says, the Mexican city of Guanajuato suffered from a heavy cholera epidemic in 1833. Many lives were lost because of this illness. To make sure the epidemic didn't spread, the dead were buried almost immediately. In some cases, the victims were buried a little too soon. I think it's talking about that story of that person that may allegedly have been buried alive. But this says, no wonder why the museum where the mummies are on display is haunted like it is. That would make sense to me, that it is haunted, again, because the bodies they were disturbed, they're on display, and if someone's spirit is upset enough with that, then they could hang out and be like, no, I'm fucking haunting this place, because leave my body alone, right? This continues, it says, excavated due to taxes. Between 1855 and 1858, many of the bodies were dug up, not because the relatives wanted their loved ones to get a proper burial, but because the Mexican government decided to raise heavy taxes on the graves. Many poor Mexicans couldn't pay these taxes, so the dead were excavated. The grave diggers stumbled upon something they didn't expect. The dead didn't turn into skeletons, but into perfectly preserved mummies. The dry Mexican heat, as well as the low humidity, dried the bodies in a natural way. Curious people wanted to have a look and were even prepared to pay for it. And so, the Mummy Museum, or El Museo de las Momias, was born. I'm excited that this is talking about this, and we're going to bring it up a bit more a little later, but this says different from the Egyptian mummies. Because the Guanajuato mummies mummified in a natural way, they differ a lot from the Egyptian mummies. Because I think when many of us hear mummy or hear about mummies, we think about Egypt, right? And how mummification was a very structured, very revered practice at the time, right? And this continues, those mummies have been preserved with care and skill, right? So they look clean and peaceful. Unfortunately, that's not the case for the Mexican mummies. Some of them look horrified with tortured expressions on their faces. If this is because the way they were preserved is debatable. And then this also makes another reference. It says that there's evidence that some of the dead may have been buried while they were still alive. This says some. So I'm thinking, was this alleged on more than one instance? Did they find several bodies that showed some sort of evidence that, oh, this person may have been buried alive? Or was it just that one story, right? And they talk about her again. They say Ignacia Aguilar, for example, suffered from cholera, but also had a rare disease where her heart could simply stop, sometimes for a whole day. Her family thought she had died and buried her the same day in fear of getting sick themselves. Again, there's that urgency to bury people who had passed away from cholera. This says, she must have woken up at some point, realizing she was buried alive. Can you imagine that? She was found face down in her coffin, and it seemed like she tried to open the coffin, pushing her back against the lid. Unfortunately, she failed to escape her horrible fate. In her desperation, she must have bitten her arms. There was a huge amount of blood in her mouth. Her face was also covered in scratches. That poor, poor woman. That is terrifying. That is like top 3 worst nightmare situation. This talks about another legend. This one, there's actually a physical evidence of it. It does exist, and it says the world's smallest mummy. There's a picture here, and it's a little baby mummy. But this does say about the baby, mummies in all shapes and sizes can be found at the museum. Sadly, there are a couple of child mummies as well. One of the child mummies is a 24-week-old fetus, which is the smallest mummy in the world. Its mother is standing right next to it. One of the other mummies is the French doctor Remigio Leroy. He was the first mummy to be exhibited in El Museo de Las Momias. Now, 108 mummies can be seen in the museum, which is built on top of the finding place. Some mummies even wear the clothes they wore the day they were buried. Okay, so again, this is a different number about how many were displayed. I do not have a date on when this was published, so that could be different. That could have changed many times. This also says, though, this detail that the museum was built on top of the finding place. So again, to me, it would make sense to keep the display at the cemetery, but because there are so many tourists, I'm like, maybe it should be moved because we don't want to disturb the rest of the cemetery or cause issue for families trying to visit their loved ones at the cemetery. So I don't know, find a spot near it. Again, City of Guanajuato, you don't need my advice. That's just me thinking out loud about what's the solution here, right? Now, this continues about the hauntings. It says, the ghosts of the Guanajuato mummies. Staff members of El Museo de Las Momias don't like spending time alone in the room where the mummies are on display. They feel as if they are being watched, and sometimes people claim to hear whispers and mumbles. That the museum is haunted won't surprise anyone. These mummies have been taken from their final resting place to be shown to the public. That's exactly what I said. I'm like, yeah, their bodies are disturbed. Their final resting places were disturbed purely for, let's be very real at the time, for what became entertainment purposes, let's be honest. So yeah, I would think a spirit may be disturbed by that. This finishes up and it says, the mummies are Guanajuato's main tourist attraction. Each year during El Dia de los Muertos, they are an important part of the celebration. I like that they are included. That I do like. I'm like, yes, because that's a day to celebrate the dead, to honor their lives. So I do like that they're included in that. And it's not just there's that museum over there, right? It says they were also used in the B horror movie Santo versus the Mummies of Guanajuato. I need to watch that. I've been really wanting to get into the Santo movies, so if anybody out there watches or has seen any of the Santo movies, let me know. What are your top picks? What should I do? Is there a box set of DVDs that I can buy? There probably is. I'm going to look for one because I want to watch these movies. This continues. Author Ray Bradbury got inspired for his short horror story, The Next in Line, after visiting the museum. And if a die-hard horror writer loses sleep over these mummies, how would a normal person react to them? Exactly. So some fun other resources to look into, the Santo versus the Mummies of Guanajuato. And then again, there's a short horror story by author Ray Bradbury, and the story is called The Next in Line, which I will probably read. This next source is from toljak.com. That's tuljak.com. And this is titled Life and Death in Guanajuato. This seems like it is a blog, but it's written by a traveler, and it's written from their point of view and their visit to the Museum of the Mummies, or the Museo de Las Momias. This says, Guanajuato left the deepest impression on me among all the places we visited on the recent trip to central Mexico. I'm going to jump forward, and it says, however, the city is especially popular with domestic tourists. Many are drawn here by the history and the city's most unusual attraction, Mummies of Guanajuato. Unlike their Egyptian counterpart, the Mummies of Guanajuato are naturally occurring phenomena and entirely accidental. The story went that there was a cholera outbreak back in the mid-19th century here in central Mexico. Again, to contain the epidemic, the local authority was quick to bury the dead in the city's public cemetery. Because of the high mortality rate, the cemetery filled up in just a matter of a few years. As it was common practice then, the burial was considered temporary for 5 to 10 years. That's something that I never heard of. So a burial, and I feel like that's probably similar now. Like, do people have to pay to keep their family, their loved ones in a cemetery? Okay, so really quick Google search tells me that it's rare now to have to pay ongoing fees, that there are some cemeteries where there's like maintenance fees and stuff, but that initially when someone gets buried and you do pay for the funeral and the burial and all that, which is wild how expensive it is, that when someone pays that there's typically like a maintenance fee or something, or a fund that is included into that initial fee. So when you pay for someone to get buried, whatever you pay for that, it's used to maintain the plot and to maintain the cemetery, right? So I'm like, okay, I'm glad there's not still a burial tax, but I would not be shocked if it happened still, or if they brought it back. I'm like, yeah, of course they would. Anyway, sorry, this continues. The burials then it was considered temporary, which is wild, for 5 to 10 years, and that after this period, relatives of the dead must provide a proper tax payment for the perpetual burial rights, quote, perpetual burial. So then this talks more about the story of how the grave diggers then had to exhume bodies because people lapsed on the burial tax, and they had to exhume bodies to make room for people that would pay. And then that's how the mummies were discovered. This talks about how the museum was set up, how they are on display. What I really wanted to read from this is they wrote about, again, this ethical dilemma, right? Because they do talk about, Dr. Leroy again, and some of the pregnant mummies and the infant ones and the child ones. It's a large collection, right? We've heard about that several times, but this says here, because I'm very interested in like the cultural perspective about this. This says, it is, of course, a little uncomfortable to speak of actual human remains as an exhibit and attraction. Actually, this reminds me of, there was that science exhibit, right? Where it was like a science exhibit with actual human bodies, and a woman saw her son in it, and she had not signed anything. Like, it was like, how did this guy's body get there? Like, was it stolen? It is. It's the case of Kim Smith and her son Christopher Todd Eric, that apparently there was a clerical order in the paperwork, and it wrongly, inaccurately marked his body as unclaimed. And so because of that, the body, I guess, was donated to science, and she saw it on TV. This says, years later, Smith froze in shock while watching a television segment on the, quote, Real Bodies anatomical exhibit in Las Vegas. She recognized her son's plastinated body on public display, and it turned into this long drawn out battle where she had to fight to reclaim her son's remains and give him a proper burial. And that is, again, see, that's what I think of when I think of how the mummies in Guanajuato, how they're being displayed. I'm like, how would their loved ones react if they knew this was happening without anybody's permission? Again, I don't want to launch into another tirade about it, but that's what I'm talking about. Is like, that happened in modern time. It's very similar. And again, it was due to a mistake, but still, it's like, it must have felt terrible for that mother to see that. Anyway, this continues. In this age of political correctness and consent, one could not visit the Museum of Mummies without raising ethical questions about displaying human remains as objects of curiosity. To date, I have not read about any efforts to locate the surviving descendants of these mummies. This may have been written before the INAH launched that study and that project to start to try identifying the bodies. Again, there's no date on when this one was written, but probably at the time the INAH hadn't launched that yet. This says, I am not sure whether there are worries that such efforts could create legal complications for the museum. I heard from a random podcast, me, a random podcaster, that the newest mummy and infant in the museum was unearthed as recently as 1999. See, that's wild to still be doing it at that time. I think initially when it happened, it's like okay, what are we dealing with here? What is happening? How widespread is this? I think the initial exhumation of the bodies should have been enough and been like, okay, we can't keep doing this. But this says, supposedly the infant's mother would visit the museum periodically to see her child. What? Although that is a nice story, I have not found the primary source of that tale. So could be completely fabricated. And I'm like, yeah, what would the timeline be? How long would it take for a body to be naturally mummified in the Guanajuato soil, right? For then a mother to be able to visit. I'm sure it would take a long time. And if it's an infant, maybe there'd be enough time for her to still be alive and go see. I don't know. There's no primary source on this. I'm not going to speculate because who knows how true that is. This says, certainly Guanajuato is not alone in exhibiting human remains. Nearly all major Western art museums hold at least a few Egyptian mummies, and plenty of Capuchin crypts are open for visitors across Europe. What distinguishes Guanajuato from others is the age of these mummies. Because of how recent these mummies are, you can't help feeling empathy and a personal connection with them. The closest comparison may be the Bodies, the exhibition, a controversial venture accused of alleged provenance of the bodies. Again, that case. So yeah, it raises a lot of questions. And I think for me, that was the interesting part of this story. Yes, obviously, the natural, unintentional mummification is very interesting, but I've always heard about that. I've never, and again, to be fair, it is in a lot of these sources. To be fair, I have not looked into the ethical concerns about it. So when we were doing research for this episode, I was like, wait, yeah, that is a huge question. That should be a big debate. And I do want to know what people are saying. I think that is very, very interesting to me as well. On that, we're going to take another break. Welcome back, Wolf friends. Okay, there is one here that I really wanted to talk about because we referenced it in the story and I was like, we cannot just brush past that. But this is from allthat'sinteresting.com and it is titled The Chilling Story of the Guanajuato Mummies, Mexico's Eerie Screaming Corpses. This was written by Gabe Pauletti, edited by Kalina Fraga, published in August of 2023. Ooh, it says updated May 5th, 2025. So I'm going to scroll down here to a section that talks about the current state of the mummies. This says, today for 85 pesos, visitors can walk the mummy-lined halls of the museum and explore a macabre piece of Mexican history. However, the museum isn't without controversy. For one, a 2023 study 3 years ago, found that the mummies may be contaminating the living with dangerous fungal spores. I'm thinking of Last of Us immediately, right? This says, though the mummies are held in glass cases, the cases themselves may not be airtight, which could allow the spores to escape. Quote, at least one of the corpses on display, which the National Institute of Anthropology and History inspected in November 2021, shows signs of a proliferation of possible fungus colonies, said the Institute, as reported by the Associated Press. Quote, it is even more worrisome that they are still being exhibited without the safeguards for the public against biohazards. That freaks me out. I'm like, I feel like people should be very, very concerned about a potential fungal outbreak or like these, it says that they're dangerous fungal spores. Like, what's the danger? Is it an infection of some sort? Is it death? Is it illness? I'm like, that's coming off of mummies. I've seen enough movies to know that will not end well, and no thank you. This continues. Secondly, many people have issued complaints regarding the treatment of the mummies. Again, there's that debate, that ethical debate. The mummies have toured across Mexico, eliciting critiques about the careless handling of some of the corpses. National Geographic reports that they have been displayed at conventions and, to the anger of many, even in Guanajuato's underground tunnels during a car rally. See, that is where it starts to feel gimmicky and sideshow, and I don't like that. It says, in an attempt to provide the mummies with greater dignity, the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico created teams to research 19th and 20th century death certificates, church documents, and newspapers to identify more of the mummies. Even DNA testing is on the table. The INAH hopes that identifying the mummies might connect them to living relatives. Quote, they should be treated like human bodies, Mexican anthropologist Juan Manuel Argüelles San Millan said to National Geographic, who was quoted earlier. This means that if a descendant of the mummies wishes to have his or her relative buried, it should be done immediately and without any problem. The quote continues here. These are just regular people who are repositories. Again, we read this quote earlier for information about the period they lived in. Conlague agreed. They walked these streets. They went to the old market. They shouldn't be a freak show. Exactly. This kind of reminds me of, we don't have a source on it, but this reminds me of the Paris catacombs. I think that would be considered an ossuary because it's a space for skeletal remains of bodies, just like a communal space for them. Now, I feel like there's a lot more lore with that, mainly because of people. Like there's like underground communities, or there's like illicit activity that happens in those tunnels because so much of the tunnels are unexplored, and it's dangerous to go down there. And so there's that idea of like that fascination with death and with how it's being displayed. There are catacomb tours, right? Like official ones that you can do. But then there's that other side of it where it's scary because of the living, because people are up to no good down there, allegedly. And then there's one of my favorite movies, As Above, So Below, which brings in like a supernatural aspect to it. It's that similar kind of vibe of like how we as living people perceive and consume death, so to speak. Okay, so speaking of the fungus, the dangerous spores, we have a source on that. This is from apnews.com. This was published March 30th, 2023. This is titled, Mexican Experts Say Mummy Exhibit May Pose Health Risks, which I think we should talk about this for sure. It says, Mexican government experts said Thursday they are concerned that a traveling display of mummies from the 1800s may pose a health risk to the public. The preserved corpses were unintentionally mummified when they were buried in crypts in dry, mineral-rich soil in the state of Guanajuato. Some still have hair, leathery skin, and their original clothing. But the National Institute of Anthropology and History, again the INAH, said in a statement that one of the mummies also appears to have fungal growths. The Federal Institute distanced itself from a state government decision to display a half dozen of the mummies in glass cases at a tourism fair in Mexico City. It was unclear whether the cases were airtight, and the Institute said it had not been consulted about the display. It is even more worrisome that they are still being exhibited without the safeguards for the public against biohazards, said the Institute. From some of the published photos, at least one of the corpses on display, which was inspected by the Institute in November 2021, shows signs of a proliferation of possible fungus colonies. The quote continues, this should all be carefully studied to see if there are signs of a risk for the cultural legacy, as well as for those who handle them and come to see them. The mummies are usually on display in the Guanajuato state capital, but they have traveled before, and some were exhibited in the United States in 2009. They were naturally preserved, some say because of the climate mineral-rich environment, other because of the sealed crypts, though no one knows for sure. They were dug up starting in the 1860s because their families could no longer pay burial fees and put on display. Right. I want to know exactly what this fungus is. I want to know more about it. Like, I want to know specifically, what is the fungus? I'm worried. I just Googled really quick. This is popularmechanics.com. Fungus was found, may pose a health risk to humans. Again, it's not saying specifically what the fungus is. I'm like, can you please tell me? Please? Because it's freaking me out. I'm like, and fungus it's cool that way, is that fungus is not just fungus. There's like millions of different kinds of fungus, and they do different things. So I wish there was more information, but this kind of looks like a dead end, no pun intended, about the fungus. It's just like, there's spores, there's fungal growths, but they're not saying what it is. I'm going to take one more quick break, and then we're going to go to our final sources. Welcome back, cool friends. Okay, so I maybe should have started with this. Maybe it's okay to save it to the end, but I just wanted to do a quick review on mummification in general. I feel like most of us are familiar with mummies, right? We've all seen the classic 1992 box office hit The Mummy starring Brendan Fraser, one of my favorite movies. This says mummification. Mummification was a painstaking and demanding process that was performed on all dead Egyptian citizens so that the body would be preserved for eternity. I didn't know it was on all citizens. By the way, this is from historiskmuseum.no. This says University of Oslo on it. So listen, I'm going to trust the university, but yeah, I thought it was reserved for like noble people, for royalty. I didn't know it was for like all citizens, but we'll see. This says, it continues, the word mummy originates from the Arab or Persian word momia. Oh, and listen, and something about the Middle East and Mexico is a lot of our words are very similar. So their word momia is M-O-U-M-I-A, and in Spanish it's M-O-M-I-A. Momia. Wow. And refers to the word bitumen or bitumen, which is pitch or tar, the substance that was originally thought to have been used by the Egyptians to preserve the bodies. The ancient Egyptian word sah describes the holy state of the mummy after a successful mummification process. Just as the soul had to endure a process or journey before reaching the blessed afterlife, the body also had to be subjected to a ritual process. Again, mummification, intentional mummification in Egypt was something that was very intentional. There was a very thorough, structured process for it. This says, a sah refers to a dead body that has gone through the meticulous religious ritual that mummification entailed. Unfortunately, there are very few Egyptian sources that describe the mummification process in detail, but some diligent Greek writers committed to paper their experiences from exotic Egypt. Herodotus, who traveled through Egypt around 450 BC, is the most well-known of these early historians. He tells of the mummification process and writes that there were 3 different standards of mummification, depending on how much the deceased could afford. There you go. We can also discern much about the process from the mummies themselves. So I think that's where I was getting the idea of it was only for a certain caste or class of people. It was standard, but much like how we bury people in the United States, the experience varies based on what people can afford, right? Unfortunately. So then this goes on to talk about the actual rituals, how the bodies were prepared, how they were dried out, how they were preserved. But I just wanted to do a quick kind of review of mummification and its origins in Egypt. Something really interesting here that they did, though, that I do want to talk about is it says cosmetic surgery, adornment, and decoration, which is something that we do in the United States too, right? This says, to enhance the mummy's appearance, the Egyptians employed several tricks of the trade. It was common to braid artificial hair into the deceased's hair so that it would look fuller and more beautiful. Again, I'm saying in the United States because that's where I live currently, right? I'm not saying we're the only ones to do that here. Again, many different cultures have varying practices when it comes to death and funerals, so to speak. But this says it was common, again, to braid the hair into the deceased hair so it would look fuller, more beautiful. Glass eyes were sometimes placed in the empty eye sockets. Animal bones or wax could be used to support the nose so it was restored to its natural shape after the removal of the brain, because that is something that happens in the mummification. Finally, the body could be decorated with cosmetic paint, both directly on the skin and on the outside of the bandages, which it's so interesting to see how long these practices have been going on and how preparing the body to look a certain way, to look, quote, its best, right? As close as what they did when they were alive it's very interesting that has been happening for a very long time. So I thought that was just something to point out. And the last source that we have here, this is from nationalgeographic.com, and it's titled Mummies Around the World, Dried, Smoked, or Thrown in a Bog. And this is by Molly Bloduff and Delicato, and this is published in January of 2016, because it got me thinking about, again, the Egyptian practices and then the unintentional naturally occurring mummification in Guanajuato. I was like, there has to be other instances around the world that I want to hear about. So this entry says, here are a few of the world's mummies, including some you may not have heard of and their strange path to pseudo-immortality. The first one on this short list is bog bodies. Ireland is known for its fairy tales of leprechauns and sprites, but it turns out there's something even stranger hiding out in the mists. Bog bodies. Bodies thrown into the bogs of Ireland hundreds of years ago are preserved by this hostile environment. Bogs have very little oxygen, keeping the bacteria that eat dead bodies at bay and allowing bog bodies to be preserved for centuries. And National Geographic has pictures of bog bodies as well. One of the most recent of Ireland's bog bodies was discovered in 2011 and the oldest bog body on record at 4,000 years old, which is 500 years older than King Tutankhamun of Egypt. Though the bog can tell us about the lifestyle, diet, and living conditions of a person, it also destroys DNA. So no one knows the body's exact lineages. Some scientists think that the Irish bog bodies were former kings, violently murdered and then tossed into the bog because they failed to protect their people from disease or famine. Little did they know that their bodies would be preserved for millennia. And these pictures are, and the one picture that is here of the bog body, it looks really, really preserved. It's wild. I'm like, this is, I think, one of the most preserved bodies or photo of a body I've seen. It kind of looks like a statue. Like the skin is now black, almost like a really dark bronze color. You can see some of the color of the hair on the mustache on this. The shape of the lip is really defined. And I'm surprised because usually it's like skin like the lips goes really fast, right? So extremely preserved. Also, Jeff was telling me about the bog bodies because he saw me looking this one up and he was like, oh, bog witches. And I was like, what's that? Apparently, initially when bog bodies were discovered, the people who discovered them, they thought they were witches and that they were asleep because of how well the bodies were preserved. They were like, oh, these are witches, they're hibernating. And, that's why this body has been here for a long time because it's a witch or something. I don't know. So like a bog witch is its own sort of like folklore from Ireland, which is really fun, and I'm going to look more into that. The next one on the list is World's Oldest Mummies. This says Chile's Chinchorro mummies are the oldest known intentionally created mummies in the world. The Chinchorro were a fishing people living on the coast of what is now southern Peru and northern Chile, about 9,000 years old. The most famous Chinchorro cemetery is in Chile, nestled between the cities of Arica and Cobija, where the remains of what are known as the, quote, black mummies were hidden for millennia. Black mummies were named for the layer of black manganese, a metal resembling iron, that coated their bodies. To create a black mummy, Chinchorro morticians cut off the body's head, arms, and legs, scooped out the organs and flesh, and often emptied the brain through a hole in the skull. This sounds very familiar to Egyptian mummification, especially the removal of the brain. This says the skin was peeled away from the body and reattached later, like taking off and putting on a sock. Ew, I'm sorry. I mean no disrespect, but I did not need it to be described that way. It says, according to a 1995 study published in the journal Latin American Antiquity, morticians completed the process by shoving hot coals into the trunk cavity to dry the cadaver. Afterward, morticians rebuilt the body with sticks and animal hair and covered it in white ash. As a final touch, morticians attached a crop of short black hair to the scalp and painted the corpse black with manganese. No one knows why the Chinchorro mummified their dead. It's possible they believed in an afterlife, or perhaps natural disasters such as earthquakes and El Niños pushed their people toward mortuary rituals and ancestor worship. On a picture here, it says that the Chinchorro mummies are the oldest known artificially preserved dead, dating to thousands of years before Egyptian mummies. Wow, that's interesting. And how these practices are also similar. Like that thing about the removal of the brain for some reason to me, and like scooping out the organs. But this happened. I thought the Egyptians were the first to do it. And for the longest time, I thought they were the only ones to do it. But it's worldwide, and the Chinchorro mummies they existed. They were mummified thousands of years before the Egyptian mummies. So that's blowing my mind right now. And then the last one on the short list says 21st century mummies. Some villagers in Papua New Guinea still mummify their ancestors today. After death, bodies are placed in a hut and smoked until the skin and internal organs are desiccated. Then they're covered in red clay, which helps maintain their structural integrity, and placed in a jungle shrine. The first documentation of Papua New Guinea's mummies was by British explorer Charles Higgins in 1907. In the 1950s, traveling missionaries have discouraged the practice, but there are still villages where revered ancestors are smoked after their deaths. And let me just say this, traveling missionaries, mind your fucking business. Sorry, not sorry. Maybe a hot take. I'm gonna say it. I think modern missionaries is just colonization. It's colonization. Leave people alone, leave indigenous cultures alone. Do not try to convert them to Christianity. Stop doing that shit. That grosses me out. I don't like that. And so, of course, they're like trying to discourage the practice of people in Papua New Guinea mummifying their ancestors because it is something that happens to revered ancestors. It is a form of like respect and worship. I'm not going to get super into it, but I may have said that before, but if I haven't before, missionaries, that's colonization to me. Oh well. This continues a little bit more kind of in general worldwide. It says how to become a mummy, if anyone's interested. And it says, some of our ancestors didn't want to rely on a mortician. They took matters into their own hands and through self-mummification. The grueling and fatal practice was undertaken by Buddhist monks in Japan, China, and India. Some believed that the end result would give them special powers. Others thought they'd one day awaken as if from a sleep. Monks hoping to attain self-mummification restricted themselves to a diet of nuts and seeds for about 3 years and then spent another 3 years eating only bark and roots. The goal was to deplete their bodies of all fat, so once they died, the bacteria that eats corpses would have less food. This diet was pioneered by the great master Buddhist Kukai, who was said to have forsworn all cereal grains before self-mummifying himself in a stone cave, according to a 1962 article published in the journal History of Religions. Afterward, monks drank a poisonous tea causing them to vomit repeatedly so they'd lose their remaining bodily fluids. The lack of water in their bodies and poison flowing through their veins would, again, make it more difficult for bacteria to decompose the body after death. When the end was near, the monks moved to a tomb, equipped only with an air tube and a bell. These devout men meditated, ringing the bell each day to tell those on the outside they were still alive. When the bell stopped ringing, the air supply was cut off, and the tomb was sealed. Despite all that work, not all attempts at self-mummification were successful. In fact, it appears that most monks failed and their bodies decomposed. Today, self-mummification is discouraged by Buddhist religious leaders, but it's a practice that has existed since at least the 12th century. And scientists are still finding more of these mummies. There are at least 24 known. In 2015, a self-mummified Buddhist monk was discovered entombed in a Buddha statue in China. Whoa, that's wild. And then this talks about the traditional classic Egyptian mummies. It says Egyptian mummies are snug in their pyramids, protected by curses, are infamous in the world of both fact and fiction. Celebrated by researchers for offering a window into the past and sensationalized by Hollywood, embalmed Egyptian corpses are the creme de la creme of mummies. Egyptians were embalmed during a process that often lasted 70 days, 70. Priests liquefied the corpse's brain and drained it through their nose. All internal organs were removed and placed in separate jars, except the heart, which was left intact because ancient Egyptians believed the heart was integral to a person's being and intelligence. Afterward, the body was dried with natron, or natrin, a type of salt, and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen. Now completely mummified, the body was placed inside its tomb along with paintings or models of food and amulets, all things the person would need in an afterlife. So, there it is, a list of mummies all around the world. That is it for all the sources. We are going to take one final break. Welcome back, Wolf friends. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. As always, I really appreciate it. Final round of updates. Once again, the book club. Make sure that you are keeping an eye on social media for meeting details and next month's book. And in general, just all updates on the show. That's at Susto Podcast on every social media platform. As always, Patreon subscribers do get to vote on what we read, and they have access to the Discord channel throughout the reading, but the book club itself is open to anybody to join. So you just grab your copy and read along with us, and then join us for the meeting at the end of the month. Again, details will be posted on social media. You can support Susto otherwise by engaging with the show wherever you are listening, leaving positive ratings and reviews and comments. And if you'd like, you can gain access to exclusive perks by visiting sustoplus.com. Major thank you to this episode's patron saints, and you are Liza, Rachel, Alejandra, Luther, April D, Josette, Mandy, Lori, Jeannie, Desiree C, Ashes, Neressa, Rachel A, Azucena, Marlene, Chata, Lainey, Desiree A, Ricardo, Vanessa, Maritza, Manormal, Iris, Flor, Selena, Nightingale, Clint, Rachel W, Armani, and Bianca. Thank you all so much for your support. It means the world to me. Thank you everybody for listening today. I will talk to you in the next one. And until then, no te asustes. Bye.